So we're going to walk through a typical deal structure and how the returns play out. So typically for a multifamily deal, they're bought through syndications, right? So under that syndication, you're going to have a general partner and you're going to have the limited partners, right? So the general partner or the sponsor will go out and find the property. They have relationships with the brokers in the specific city or the neighborhood that they're looking for those properties in, right? So for this example, we'll take a neighborhood of like San Antonio. So the general partner will go and build relationships with brokers in San Antonio. They'll find a property, they'll make an offer on that property, and they'll get it accepted, right? So once that offer is accepted, the general partner now goes into due diligence, where now they're doing lease audits. They're going through each individual apartment separately and confirming that they all have stoves, they all have sinks, they all have, all the drywall and the painting looks good, right? And what they don't have, you're going to also document that as well, right? So that's your due diligence. And then the general partner is also going to be figuring out the financing and preparing a PPM. A PPM is a private placement memorandum. And the reason why private placement memorandums are really important is because it gives the general partner the ability to give the limited liability partner, the passive investor, the person that's bringing capital to the table, an understanding of the worst case scenarios that can happen at this property, right? So the PPM is going to lay out all of those things. They're going to tell you the returns, but the PPM is also going to tell you what bad can happen at this property, right? So the investors, once the PPM is created, the PPM will then be circulated to the investors. The investors will be able to review the PPM, right? And the PPM will show them what they will be able to receive if everything goes as planned, as the pro forma, right? So you'll get all your returns laid out, and it'll also say all the bad things that potentially could happen if things don't go as planned, right? And that's the way the lawyers protect the operator as well. So the PPM will also show the splits between the sponsor or the general partner and the limited partner, the passive investors, right? Okay. So the PPM, breaking it down into more detail, I have the property details and specifications, the terms, the sponsor's contribution, like is the sponsor bringing money to the deal as well, right? It'll give you the equity percentages, whether it's a 70-30 split, 70 to the passive investors and 30 to the general partners, right? Or if it's a 75-25 split, 75% to the passive investors and 25% to the general partners. And we'll go through that in another slide, right? So you got your equity percentages, that's what we just reviewed. You got your investment projections, like, is this going to be 100% return in 5, 6, 7 years? It's going to tell you that. It's also going to tell you the fees that the sponsor or the general partner is going to charge, right? Whether there's an asset management fee, is there an acquisition fee, right? It's going to give you the payout and distribution details, like when you should actually receive your money, right? Is it a monthly distribution? Is it a quarterly distribution? Is it a distribution every 6 months? It's also going to give you comparable properties in the area, right? So they're going to give you, there's this deal that we bought in San Antonio, and they're going to say, well, within that 10-mile radius of this property, there's property A sold for this amount, and property B sold for that amount, and property C sold for this amount, right? So you're going to be able to have an understanding that you're not overpaying for that property. It's also going to lay out all the risks, which we talked about. All the bad things that are going to that could potentially happen will be laid out in the PPM, and then it will also include any other material disclosures that would be beneficial for the passive investor to understand.
So when it comes to splitting the equity, what we're talking about is a split here between the general partners and the limited partners, and who owns what percentage of the equity, right? That's decided before the deal even begins, and it's put forth in the PPM. So, like Oliver said, like when you're reviewing a PPM, there's going to be a section where it talks about what percentage is going to be owned by the general partner and what percentage is going to be owned by the limited partner. And what those get set at depends on a couple of things, right? The first being really how juicy is the deal, right? How much profit is on the table to potentially be made. If there's, a lot of profit, then maybe you can get away with taking a 30% cut for the GP and still having the deal make sense for the investors from an overall standpoint, right? And then also, how good is your track record as a sponsor, right? If this is the first deal you're ever doing, might be a little tougher to kind of get that 30% general partner split. However, if you've got a great long track record, you always kill it for your investors, right? They're going to say, fine, you can take, 80-20, and that's fine, because I know the return that you're telling me you're going to get from me anyway at the end of the day. So just a couple of things that you want to think through when you're setting this percentage, right? This is essentially who owns what percentage of the equity of the property. And then another important consideration is preferred returns, right? So what is a preferred return? Well, it's a structure that puts the limited partners in a preferred position, right? Essentially, when distributions are made, they have preferential treatment over the first X percentage of that cash flow coming off the property. So for example, if you set an 8% preferred return, that's the hurdle rate. That's the rate that your returns on that property need to meet or exceed in order for anyone but the investors, the limited partners, to get a cut of that cash flow, right? So just an example, right? If your property is making 10% returns and your preferred return hurdle rate is 8%, the first 8% of those 10% returns is going straight to the limited partners, right? They're getting 100% of that 8%. Then you've got 2% left over, right? So that percentage is what sponsors are then eligible for a portion of that cash flow, right? And typically that would be assessed based on the equity split that we just talked about, right? So that the remaining 2% would then be split. If you've got a 70-30 equity split, then 30% of that 2% will go to the general partners and 70% of that 2% will go to the limited partners. Most of the time you'll see preferred returns in the 6 to 8% range for multifamily. That's just kind of your standard. You do have the freedom to make it whatever you want, but typically if investors see things outside of that range, it may might have some questions on it. And then really, overall, right, it's just a good way to sweeten the deal for your investors, right? To give them a little bit better margin of safety on a deal where they're locking their money up for 5 or 6 years, right? They're most of the time they're going to want, something, a pretty good rate of return, and they're going to want, as much kind of safety as you can offer them. This is just a good way to do it to make investors kind of happy with it.
And I also want to add there, Brian, too, that a preferred return is not a guaranteed return. It's not guaranteed, meaning that if the deal goes south and doesn't generate any money, the preferred return doesn't mean anything, right? So it's definitely not a guaranteed return. It's a preferred return means you get preferential treatment over the money that is made before the operator gets their money. So you get the first 7-8% of the deal if you have a preferred return.
Yeah, absolutely. But the property's got to be making any money at all, right, for that to be to come into play.
So how do the sponsors get paid, right? So the sponsors get paid in a number of different ways. You have your acquisition fee, which is typically between 1 and 5%. For the deals that I've been a part of, it's always been between 2 and 3%, right? So that's like if you buy a $10 million asset, you would charge between 2 or 3% of the purchase price for that asset. And that would get split amongst the general partnership. That would be considered the acquisition fee. And that's important because now the general partners get paid back for the expenses that they incurred prior to the acquisition, right? So then you have your asset management fee. The asset management fee is the fee that is charged to the property for managing the property manager, for managing the general contractor, for managing the asset and positioning the asset to win. It takes energy. And that asset management fee is compensation for that energy exerted into the property to have it perform, right? So there's the asset management fee. That's typically between 1 and 2%. Then the sponsors can also get paid on the excess cash flow that the property generates. So in the previous slide, we were talking about a preferred return of 7%. So if the property generated 10%, right, for that year, then the investors would get 7% of that. And then the additional 3% would get split depending upon the way the sponsor has set up that deal. So if it was a 70-30 split, 70% of that 3% would go to the passive investors, and then 30% of that 3% would then go to the general partners, right? So then there's also the disposition fee. The disposition fee is a fee that is charged to the investors at the date of sale for that property. And I typically don't see disposition fees because it's almost like a negative at the end of a transaction with your investors. Like you're charging them to sell the asset, whereas you already have made money, right? Those fees can range between 1% and 5%. And disposition fees, again, like I've never seen one in one of the deals that I've done. And I haven't met with any partners that have dealt with a disposition fee, but they are out there and people do charge these fees. And I guess if the deal was really, really juicy, you could potentially charge something like this, but I haven't seen a disposition fee charge. Then the sponsors can also invest as a limited partner, as a passive investor, so that their money is passively growing as well. And honestly, the money that I have growing as a passive investor is my favorite returns that I get, because it's growing passively. It's growing without me having to exert energy on it, right? I have control over it, right? I'm not putting it in a bank, or I'm not putting it in the stock market, letting somebody else manage it, right? So I love the money that I have that grows passively in my deals, right? And then the sponsors can also get compensated at the proceeds once the property sells, right? So if the property generates in excess of the preferred return, then the splits will go back to how they were originally designed, whether it was 70-30, 70% to the passive investor and 30% to the general partner, right? And that's why this is where general partners really make their money in a syndication, is at the sale, right? Like the cash flow and the preferred returns really go directly to the passive investors, but the general partners can make significant gains, multi-million-dollar gains at the sale of a property, right? And they're splitting those gains. 70% would go to the passive investor, and a big chunk, 30% or 25%, would go to the general partnership.
Yeah, it's really good to have sponsors investing passively in their deal as well, right? Not only are you going to make money as a sponsor if you put money in your deal, but there's also a huge boost of confidence to the limited partners if they see the sponsors jumping in with a whole bunch of money, right? Typically, we like to see sponsors that have at least the minimum and most preferably more than the minimum investment invested themselves, right? So, I mean, if you're an investor, if you're looking at a deal, what are you going to think if the sponsors aren't putting any of their own money in as a limited partner as well? So that's just definitely another important thing to keep in mind.
Right. And Brian, we did need to include. So when, in addition to selling the property and the sponsor getting money, if you actually refinance this property, you keep the property and refinance it, you take money out of the property, and the property's still cash flowing, the property's still paying the mortgage, take money out, then the sponsors would get a 70-30 split of that refinance money as well, or a 25-75 split of that refinance money, right? So there's a number of ways to generate resources or funds or payments as a sponsor.
So it's all a balancing act, right? When we start adding these fees on there, it starts to be good for the sponsor, but at the end of the day, you got to still make sure the deal is going to make sense for the investors, right? And what does that mean, right? So typically when we're targeting returns for these investments, it's going to be over a 5 or 6 year period. So the investors are locking their money away, right? They can't touch this money for 5 or 6 years. They're going to want a really good rate of return in order to compensate them for putting their money on hold for that long. So when we're thinking about the typical returns, right? From a cash on cash standpoint, investors are going to be looking for a 10% average cash on cash return over the life of the investment. They're going to be looking for a 15% or higher internal rate of return over the life of the investment. And they're going to be looking for a 100% or better total return, right? So they're going to be looking to double their money essentially at the end of this deal. So kind of the deals that we see that are successful in gaining investor attention, they all meet these targeted returns because, just think about it from a standpoint of putting your money in the deal, you're going to want something pretty juicy coming out the back end. And that's what you have to deliver in order to get the investor's attention.